Prejudices. An original story adaptation by ButterflyCoffee. Devon, 1937. A fairly quiet place to most people, or at least those who don't live in the area. These people see it as a haven, the quiet part of England with the stunning moorland, the winding rivers and green fields. To the locals, though, it's a different story. It's all industrial. Bustling towns, busy fishing ports, smoke pluming high from the clay quarry, and most of all, the thriving railway community. Newton Abbot was a hub for the Devon folk, connecting them to places such as Brixham, Plymouth and Dawlish. It was a big station too, with a work shed, a wagon shed, loading bays, and even a large shunting yard next to the River Tean. The station had been around since Brunel's atmospheric railway and had acted as a central station for the people in the town to get away or for visitors to come in. A branch line turned off to the left, which went to Moreton Hampstead through Heathfield, and the main line lay to the right, which went on to Exeter and even all the way to Paddington in London. A railway, of course, can't run without engines, and what a variety there were! Since Newton Abbot was a place where the mighty engines of the LMS often clashed with the just as powerful and proud Western locomotives of the GWR, a whole bunch of classes could be seen passing through, from the regular pannier tank to the odd Princess Coronation. A few engines were permanently based there, though, and they also provided plenty of character. There was Duchess, an elderly 2P who ran along the main line, along with Lizzie, the 43XX, and Julie, the Black 5. These three weren't seen as often, but they provided essential passenger and goods services across Devon, Somerset, and in Julie's case, the entire country. The ones who stayed a little closer to home were Louise, a Great Western Prairie who ran the Moreton Hampstead branch service, and Hercule, a 4200 who ran the large shunting yard, colloquially known as Hackney Yard. These two kept the business around the station running just fine, keeping to the timetable like clockwork, with little to no fuss. Well, not in Hercule's case anyway. As of recently, however, motive power was beginning to become an issue. Until now, the prime motive power for shunting had consisted largely of elderly pre-grouping locomotives, as well as half a dozen pannier tanks. However, muddled demand for motive power had resulted in at least 4 out of the 6 resident panniers being transferred elsewhere, with the majority of the elder locomotives being withdrawn for scrap. The remaining panniers that had stayed were intended for shunting, but instead were used for china clay runs on the Moreton Hampstead branch. To compensate for this, 3 more panniers were transferred to fulfil the shunting duties, but there were soon more complications. One pannier had exceeded its miles and was in need of immediate general repair, while the other had suffered from a busted lubricator. This meant that Hercule had to stand in for the teething arrivals. He wouldn't call himself work-shy at all, but he definitely knew his limits. "It's all gone a bit mental," he said to the other engines one night. Only Julie wasn't home. She was away in Kent and wouldn't be back for a few days. "I don't mind a good day's slog, but I'm starting to get a little puffed out." "Perhaps you're getting old," Louise sniffed. "Working with dirty, smelly trucks will do that to an engine, I guess. I do feel sorry for you." "Easy, Tigress," reproached the tank engine. "If it weren't for me, you wouldn't have a real train at all, so just watch your lip." "Hercule has a valid point," Lizzie said bluntly. "If another train is late, business folk won't be using our services to transport their goods about. Something needs to be done about it. PDQ. "But what?" asked Louise, now paying proper mind to the subject. "If we're all stacked up with our own services, we can't do anything, even if we wanted to." "Not that you would, eh?" sniggered Hercule. "I beg your pardon," gasped Louise haughtily. "I try to show a little concern for our beloved station, and you have the cheek to come out with that. Perfectly dreadful."
"You spend too much time around the castles, you do," grunted Lizzie. "Besides, you set yourself up for that one."
"I say!"
"Please, please, simmer down, everyone," called Duchess, bringing the others' moods down to a gentler level. "There must indeed be a way to solve our current situation. But for now, let us sleep, for there is no doubt that we must have a busy day ahead of us," she said, addressing everyone on shed. "Good night, everyone."
"Night, Duchess," everyone mumbled, and went to sleep. Lizzie kept her eyes open long enough to shoot Duchess a dirty look, but since she never retaliated, the grumpy goods engine gave up and went to sleep. The next morning, Mr. Turner sat behind his desk and continued to scan for any sheds that could spare a locomotive, even if it were a branch-line shed. Mr. Turner was the shed-master at Newton Abbot at this time. He liked to pride himself on being a fair and forward man, but he could be quite strict at times. He ran a hand through his hair. Either there wasn't an engine to spare, or the engine offered wasn't powerful enough, and those that were powerful enough lived too far away. A knock at the door broke Mr. Turner out of his thoughts. He sighed, set down his paperwork, and turned his attention to the source of the noise. "Come in," he called, struggling to keep a neutral tone. The door opened, and two tall men in overalls and hats stepped inside. "Ah, morning, gents," Mr. Turner said.
"Morning, Turner," the other one replied. "How's sorting out the motive power crisis coming along, then?"
Mr. Turner let out a defeated sigh.
"I'm fighting a losing battle, to be honest. Locomotives are either too far away or too underpowered."
"Nonsense," the other man cried. "We drove the Dean goods all the way up the Lickey with a loaded—"
"Oi!" the first man silenced. "Any more out of you and I'll have you back on the Dean goods, and make no mistake."
Mr. Turner tactfully interrupted the men's quarrel. "I'm a little reluctant about this one, but I'm at the end of my tether," he said. "I'm tempted to ask Bath Green Park, but it's a mixed bag. You're bound to end up with 6 of one or half a dozen of the other, if you take my meaning."
"I'm afraid we don't, sir," the men said.
"Come on, lads, use your heads. Who else does the Great Western share the Somerset and Dorset with?" The two men looked at each other, paused, then looked back to Mr. Turner.
"Oh," said one in a low voice.
"I see what you mean now, Turner," muttered the other.
"There you go, then." The shedmaster sighed in an agitated manner.
"If his lordships up there catch wind of this idea, they'll make sure I don't live it down for a good while yet. Not till I retire, at least. I've sent out the letters, and I'll let you all know when I get a moment's notice." He assigned the two to an engine and watched them walk away. Mr. Turner rubbed the bridge of his nose and thought hard for a moment. Everyone knew that the LMS and Great Western were bitter rivals, but it rang very true indeed on the Somerset and Dorset line, as engines of both regions ran side by side and were always battling for contracts. It was the equivalent of taking a blowtorch to a loaded gunpowder van. An engine from either side would have undoubtedly spelled trouble, but an engine was badly needed, regardless of the company it ran for. Mr. Turner nodded astutely and picked up a pen. He knew what he had to do. Around a fortnight later, Hercule stopped to take on water. The tower was stationed at the entrance to the station, so he could see most of the activity going on. Louise was snorting off with a heavy branch service, whilst Lizzie dozed on shed. Passengers were milling about on the platform, and he could see Mr. Turner striding purposefully up to what the railway men dubbed Platform 9, a small platform outside the station which served the neighbouring Tean Valley line. There, Hercule spotted something he hadn't seen. A small black tank engine, which looked to be of Midland design if he wanted to be precise. The engine couldn't have looked more than 5 or 6 years old, and Hercule could read the build number, as well as the company it worked for, slapped across the bunker and tanks in cream lettering. LMS 4760. He tried to push the instant suspicion of rivalry out of his smokebox and wondered what the engine was doing here. Visiting, perhaps? The 4200 saw Mr. Turner climb into the cab and watched as the engine crossed the yard. They seemed to be approaching him. The engine then halted nearby, as Hercule was bringing a line of coaches out to the main station. "Hercule," smiled Mr. Turner, "I thought we might catch you. This is 4760. I've been able to loan her from Bath Green Park until those panniers are back on the road." Hercule smiled gratefully. "Thank you kindly, sir. If she proves to be helpful, I'll request that she be made a part of the fleet here in exchange for one of the panniers," Mr. Turner explained. "She's handled carriages before, but I want you to go over shunting wagons and show her how we run things at Newton Abbot, all right?" "Right-o then, sir," the tank engine replied. Mr. Turner thanked 4760's crew, jumped down and left. Hercule looked down to the tank engine, who stood waiting. Without him realizing, he scanned the shunter up and down, as if she were about to come out with some snarky comment. Knowing that cooperation was best earned through respect and civility, he again pushed such thoughts away. "Right then, love," he began. "Shall we get started?" The tank engine smiled in consent, and the two began. The two had a pleasant afternoon, taking carriages to the station, then back to the carriage shed at the other side of the site. Hercule did find that 4760 wasn't much of a talker. She preferred to watch him working, then try and copy his movements, whilst he smoothed over any hiccups she made. Hercule didn't mind this, but he did like to have a degree of communication. "That's just what gets us through round here, love," he explained. "If we don't know what you're thinking, how could we help if we needed to? Or what if we don't know you've heard us? It's just so we can do our best around here, okay?" Hercule smiled as he saw 4760 sadly cast her eyes down to the ballast. As the two engines stopped for water later that afternoon, a whisper between Hercule's crew ran that Duchess's 5 o'clock express was due to leave soon. Hercule nearly ran himself ragged trying to get the coaches together so that he wouldn't get hassled by Lizzie or Louise as he had been over the past few weeks. As he disappeared around the bend, he yelled to the shunter to keep an eye on the yard. The tank engine barely had time to feel overwhelmed with her new responsibility when a loud bark startled her. She looked and saw a grubby Great Western tender engine coming for water. 4760 had never seen an engine look so dirty, make so much noise, or look so grumpy. She seemed to have a permanent scowl stuck to her face. The engine grumbled loudly to her crew as they filled the tank. "Can't believe it. I can't even rest for a bloody minute without being shafted into doing another train. This is just getting mental, all this rushing around like your funnel isn't screwed on right." "Oh, hush, Lizzie," soothed her fireman. "Just be grateful you don't have to go very far, just down to Torquay and back." "Be grateful," she grunted. "I'll be more thankful once I've had some sleep, I think." The engine yawned, staring lazily at the sky when she overheard her fireman up on the tender making a fuss over the little engine behind her. "Oh, now aren't you just it?" he smiled fondly. "My favourite tank engine as a lad you lot were. Special place in here for all of you," he added, patting his chest. 4760 smiled, turning pink at the compliment. "Oi!" Lizzie hollered, making both 4760 and her fireman jump. "Instead of fawning over the engine behind me like some bloody basket case, tell it to shunt my train together, would you?" Lizzie's crew went to chastise their engine, while 4760's took her off to shunt the wagons needed for the train to Torquay. Poor 4760 was disheartened by Lizzie's rudeness, and immediately felt afraid of her. After all, she'd heard stories of Western engines tearing off a Midland engine's paint if you didn't watch it. As soon as the wagons were together and Lizzie had backed down,
Hercule returned, and he was surprised to find 4760 seek refuge behind him, cowering as Lizzie pulled away. "You okay there, darling?" he half chuckled. "Poor thing seems a little frightened by the double X," said her driver, and he went on to explain what had happened. Hercule listened understandingly, and finally gave a good-natured laugh. Someone afraid of Lizzie? He didn't know whether to find it refreshing or funny. "I can see why she gives some engines the heebie-jeebies," he said to the confused engine. "Our Lizzie's a tough old lass. War veteran, takes no nonsense, and a hard worker to boot. Aside from Julie, I've never known an engine shift so much as Lizzie has. A real team member, make no mistake. Only problem is she's got a face like a cabbage." 4760 burst into laughter, breaking her unrecognised vow of silence. Hercule ended up laughing too, glad to make his companion more relaxed. "Well, now I've got a beep out of you," he chortled. "You have a name I can call you by?" 4760 seemed thoughtful. "No, not really," she said after a while. "I've always been 4760. Hercule sighed to himself. "Young uns through and through," he said wistfully, before looking back at 4760. "Well then, you can call me Hercule, my love, all right?" "Okay." 4760 liked Hercule. Underneath a sharp tongue and dirty paint simmered a heart of gold. "And if our Livesey gives you any trouble, just tell her she looks like a cabbage, all right?" Both engines set off to work again, laughing and smiling as if they'd known each other for many years. That night, 4760 met the other engines for the first time. She already knew Lizzie from their brief encounter, but she had yet to meet Duchess and Julie and Louise. The Black Five smiled down at her with a quick, knowing eye. "Hello down there," she smiled. "Glad to see a familiar sight of a ginty around here. Let's hope you find Newton all homely, eh?" Duchess gazed at 4760 in the same way a mother would a child, warm, gentle, and welcoming. "We do hope you decide to stay with us, 4760. We also hope you will accept us as a family who always has your bunker if you need us." 4760 was about to respond when Louise cut in. "Never mind all of them. It's me you should be most concerned with, Midland shunter," she boasted. "I run all the passenger services on the branch line around here. I guess you may call me the Big Cheese." "Oh, is your name not Louise anymore? Or should we call you Cheese Louise from now on?" Hercule's remark sent titters through the crowd. Louise tried to recover, feeling flustered. "None of your impudence now, Hercule. I'm simply trying to introduce myself to a newcomer, and you feel the need to show me up. It really is quite thoughtless of you." "As is the need to give yourself airs and graces you don't deserve and make yourself look like a plonker," Lizzie stated bluntly. The engines laughed again, forcing Louise into an embarrassed silence. "Anyway," Lizzie continued, "the Midlander comes here, she's got to learn how to work. And when I say work, I'm not talking about faffing around in the yard work like most Midland shunters do. I'm talking about the other stuff. Stand-in duties, banking duties, passenger and goods hops, the list goes on." "Wow!" gasped 4760 in awe. The words came out before she could stop them. "That's a lot of work." "You get used to it then, ginty," grunted Lizzie without empathy towards the young tongue engine. "That's most of what you'll be capable of doing, and you'll be doing it every day of every week of every year you hear. You'll be working in the baking hot and the biting cold with little to no rest, as we Western engines do. So let's hope we hear no whining or complaining coming from you, Midlander. I don't like irresponsibility or laziness around here, and—" "Give over, Lizzie," Julie said quickly. "We don't need your life story, love," reprimanded Hercule. Lizzie sighed a cloud of steam, furrowing her brow. "Keep out of it," she rumbled. "I'm just warning the Midland runt so she knows up front. Doesn't come as such a shock then, does it?" "We know, Lizzie, but please try to be more subtle, or at least not so callous. After all, 4760 is only young. We don't want to frighten her."
"Life isn't all sunshine and flowers, Duchess," said Lizzie quietly. "Every once in a while someone throws mud in your face, but you gotta go on regardless." "They threw more than mud at you, didn't they, Lizzie? Now shut your face, or what's left of it." Julie's question and cutting remark made Lizzie submit to silence. The Western 43XX growled and closed her eyes to sleep. The other engines, with nothing to add and nothing to comment on, wished each other good night. 4760, who'd been quiet throughout the whole conversation, had a lot to take in. She had simple opinions of everyone and felt exhilarated and intimidated by what Lizzie had said. For a young engine like her to be able to learn new things and prove she was a good worker was a challenge for her, but one she hoped she could manage. However, she was frightened by Lizzie's indomitable attitude and tough exterior. Was working in a bigger environment going to be as easy as she thought? 4760 couldn't think about it. She gave a huge yawn and settled down to sleep. It had only been a few hours before 4760 began to stir again, not because morning had arrived, but from a noise. A particular noise that would become as commonplace as the sight of railwaymen in a depot of this size. The sound of wheels clunking over the rails, and the faint hiss of steam as the sound of an engine drew near. 4760 still kept her eyes shut, thinking nothing of it. Just another engine coming in for the night. The sharp groan of aged brake blocks grinding against wheels was what made the little Ginty flinch. With another whoosh of steam, all was silent until... "What do you think you're doing here?" The venomous tone made 4760 open her eyes. At first glance, it appeared to be a normal pannier tank speaking, but a second glance proved she was wrong. For starters, his cab, or whatever there was of it, looked like it had the back wall and a fair chunk of roof taken off, and unlike most panniers, which had gleaming bright brasswork and copper, this one's was faded. Not deteriorating by any means, but it certainly looked like it hadn't been cleaned in a long time. "Well, speak for yourself, Midlander," it said again, his authoritative tone not matching his shape at all. However, the venom in his voice remained regardless. "What do you think you're doing here?" 4760 was stunned into silence. "Who, me?" she stuttered at last. "Well, you're the only one that responded to me, so you must be the Midlander I'm addressing. Aside from that cheap imitation over there. And you've still yet to answer my question," he added, becoming more deadpan by the minute. The Ginty felt nervous. If she thought Lizzie was frightening, then this engine, despite his being a shunter, was easily as frightening, if not more so. She consistently struggled to speak. I'm just standing in for the two panniers until they return from repair." 4760 fumbled for the right words and managed to reply to the pannier tank, whose eyes immediately flashed with a look of anger and revulsion. "For two?" he scoffed. How his outburst didn't stir any of the other engines out of their slumber was anyone's guess, but he ranted on. "You're not even worth half of one of us. In fact, I'd be generous in saying you're worth even that amount." He trailed off, but soon began seething yet again. What on earth is this railway coming to when we have to rely on such petty carbon copies? 4760 tried to speak out. "Please, I've done nothing. "Oh, but you have indeed done something. Your being here is an insult to me, my brotherhood,
and all my fellow brothers who shall proceed after me. These simpletons might not know it," he went on, glancing to the line of sleeping engines. "But you insult the very name of the Great Western Railway by your presence here alone. Heaven knows," the pannier tank continued, "I'd continue to run myself into the ground rather than accept help from an archaic, underpowered piece of Caledonian scrap such as you." The horrendous comments from the pannier, if they hadn't struck oiling points in the Ginty before, certainly had now. Poor 4760 could barely keep the hurt out of her expression. The pannier just sniffed in disgust. "You were grovelling about standing in for those panniers until they returned?" "Yes," 4760 whined. "Well, understand this, Midlander." The bitterness practically rolled off the pannier's lips easier than a roller-bearing wagon. "No sooner do my brothers return than you go back to whatever infested, filth-ridden, industrial estate you dared emerge from to begin with. Is that understood?" 4760 kept silent. She'd been ordered around by others before when she was freshly built, but never to the extent where she was vilified. At least with other Midland engines, she only felt humbled or embarrassed. Here, however, she couldn't have felt more mortified or humiliated. The Ginty never understood the whole LMS and Great Western rivalry to begin with. They were all locomotives, weren't they? They all ran on coal and water, regardless of the work they performed. They all had a driver and a fireman in their cab, and they all ran on rails. What was all the antagonism for? "I said, is that understood, Midlander?" 4760 winced at the awful tone that the pannier tank used. The venom was back in his voice. Despite the deep fear she held for the engine, the little Ginty managed to look him evenly in the eye. "As clear as the rails we run on," she stated at last. Still repulsed by her presence, but satisfied with the response that she gave, the pannier wheezed away, his barking puff and clacking wheels echoing as he trundled out of sight. 4760 never did get to sleep again that night. She felt she had far too much to think over. Amongst the feelings of uneasiness and hatred, the shunter had a funny feeling she'd run into that prejudiced pannier tank again. She didn't know when, how, or why, but she knew she would, sooner or later. There was a lot to learn and experience at Newton Abbot, and little 4760 had only just begun to scratch the surface of the life she would lead.